The blood froze on the wind before it could stain the snow, and Tessa Barrett knew with terrifying certainty that she was going to die in this white wasteland with her baby still inside her. She had been walking for hours, maybe days, time losing all meaning in the endless stretch of Wyoming winter that had swallowed the world whole. The wagon had overturned 3 miles back when the axle snapped on a hidden rock beneath the drifts, and her husband Marcus had taken their only horse to ride to Opal for help. That was yesterday morning, before the second storm rolled in like God's own fury, before the contractions started tearing through her belly with the rhythm of a war drum. She had waited in the shelter of the overturned wagon as long as she could, but when the snow began to bury it completely and the pains came so close together she could barely breathe between them, she knew she had to move or be entombed. The year was 1883, and women died in childbirth every day across the frontier, but Tessa had always believed she would survive anything. She was 22 years old and strong, the daughter of a Missouri farmer who had taught her to shoot straight and work harder than any man. She had married Marcus Barrett 6 months ago after a whirlwind courtship that her parents had warned her against, and she had followed him west to Wyoming territory, where he promised they would build a cattle ranch and a life together. But Marcus drank too much and planned too little, and now she was alone in a blizzard with her body splitting apart to bring a child into a world that seemed determined to kill them both. Her legs gave out when the next contraction hit, sending her sprawling face first into a snowdrift that rose higher than her waist. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left, and when she rolled onto her back, the sky was nothing but white, no difference between earth and heaven. The pain was enormous, taking up all the space inside her body and her mind, and she heard herself making sounds like an animal caught in a trap. She managed to pull herself behind a small outcropping of rocks that provided almost no shelter, but at least blocked some of the wind. Her dress was soaked through and frozen stiff, and when she tried to arrange herself into some kind of position that made sense for what was about to happen, she realized how little she actually knew about birth. Her mother had told her some things in whispered conversations that felt like they had happened in another lifetime, and she had helped pull a calf once when she was 13. But this was different. This was her own body, turning itself inside out with a purpose she could not stop or control. The baby came fast once she stopped fighting it, sliding into her shaking hands in a rush of fluid that steamed in the frozen air and then immediately began to crystallize. The infant was blue and silent, and for a horrible moment Tessa thought she had carried this life across half the continent, only to deliver death into the snow. But then she rubbed the tiny chest with her numb fingers, and the baby jerked and gasped and let out a thin wail that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was a boy. She wrapped him in her shawl and then her petticoat, using her teeth to tear the fabric because her fingers would not cooperate. She tied off the cord with a piece of her dress hem and then bit through it, gagging at the taste, but knowing it had to be done. The baby was crying steadily now, a good strong sound, and she pulled him inside her coat against her chest, where her body heat might keep him alive a few minutes longer. She tried to stand, but could not, so she curled on her side in the snowdrift with her arms around her baby and tried to remember prayers her grandmother had taught her. The words would not come. There was only the sound of the wind, and her baby's cries gradually growing weaker, and the strange warm feeling spreading through her that she knew was her body beginning to shut down. She had heard freezing to death was peaceful at the end, like falling asleep, and she hoped that was true. She hoped her baby would not suffer. She hoped Marcus would find them and bury them properly, and maybe say something kind over their graves. The darkness came in waves, pulling her under and then releasing her, and she was not sure anymore what was real and what was the dream of dying. She thought she heard a horse, or maybe it was just the wind, and then there were hands on her, large and impossibly warm, and a man's voice saying words she could not understand through the noise in her head. Flynn Ingram had been tracking the mountain lion for 2 days when the storm forced him to turn back toward his cabin. He was a professional hunter and occasional guide for wealthy Easterners who wanted to shoot elk and bear, and at 24 years old, he had spent more time alone in the Wyoming wilderness than he had spent among people. He preferred it that way. People complicated things with their wants and their words and their expectations, while the wild was honest in its cruelty and indifferent to your plans. He almost missed the woman entirely. She was just a small dark shape against the snow behind a cluster of rocks that he would have ridden past if his horse had not spooked and shied sideways. He dismounted to investigate, expecting to find a dead animal or maybe some abandoned gear from another unlucky traveler, and instead he found a woman curled in a snowdrift with blood frozen on her legs and a bundle pressed against her chest. He knew she was dead. No one could survive what he was looking at. But when he knelt beside her to check anyway, her eyes opened and focused on him with such desperate intensity that he jerked backward in surprise. "The baby," she whispered. Her lips were blue and her words slurred, but her meaning was clear. "Please." Flynn carefully pulled back the layers of frozen fabric and found the infant. The child was barely moving, its skin mottled purple and white, and he did not think it would survive either. But the woman was looking at him with those eyes that would not let him go, and he found himself nodding. "I have got him," he said, pitching his voice to cut through her fading consciousness. "I am going to get you both warm. Stay with me." He did not waste time with gentleness. He lifted the woman in his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, and carried her to his horse. The gelding was well trained and stood steady while Flynn managed to get into the saddle with the woman cradled in front of him, the baby still clutched to her chest. He wrapped his heavy coat around both of them and spurred the horse into the fastest pace he dared in the deep snow. His cabin was only a mile away, but it felt like 100. The woman drifted in and out, her head lolling against his shoulder, and several times he thought he had lost her. He talked to her constantly, saying anything to keep her connected to consciousness, telling her about the cabin and the fire he would build and how she was going to be fine, even though he was not sure he believed any of it. When they finally reached the small log structure he had built 3 years ago, he carried her straight inside and laid her on his bed near the stone fireplace. The cabin was cold, since he had been gone for days, but he had it built for survival, and within minutes he had a fire roaring. He left the woman long enough to unsaddle his horse and get the animal into the small attached stable with feed and water. Then he returned to face the problem he had brought into his home. The woman was unconscious now, her breathing shallow and irregular. The baby had stopped moving entirely. Flynn had delivered foals and helped with difficult lambings, but human babies were different, and he was acutely aware of how little he knew. Still, he had to try. He unwrapped the infant first and was relieved to find it was at least still breathing, though barely. He warmed water on the fire and carefully cleaned the child, then wrapped it in his softest flannel shirt and placed it in a basket near the hearth where the warmth would be constant but not too intense. The baby's color began to improve almost immediately, the purple fading to pink, and after a few minutes it let out a weak cry that gave him the first real hope. The woman was a more complicated matter. He knew he had to get her out of the wet, frozen clothes, but he hesitated, aware that undressing an unconscious woman he did not know crossed lines he was not comfortable crossing. Then her body convulsed with violent shivering, and he stopped debating with himself and just did what needed doing. He stripped away the ruined dress and undergarments as clinically as possible, trying not to see her as anything but a patient who needed help. There was more blood than he had expected, pooling beneath her, and he remembered hearing somewhere that women could bleed to death after giving birth. He did not know how to stop it. He cleaned her as best he could with warm water and packed clean cloth between her legs, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned and continued to build up the fire until the cabin was almost too hot for him. For the rest of that day and into the night, Flynn moved between the woman and the baby, keeping them both warm and alive through sheer stubborn determination. He had goat's milk in his stores, meant for making cheese, and he managed to get some into the baby by dipping a clean cloth into the warmed milk and letting the infant suck on it. The child was weak, but had strong instincts, and gradually it began to take more. The woman did not wake. Her fever climbed as the night wore on, and Flynn found himself sponging her face and neck with cool water, murmuring reassurances he was not sure she could hear. She was young, he realized now that he could actually see her, maybe 20 or 21, with dark hair that might have been beautiful when it was not matted with ice and blood. Her face was fine-boned and determined even in unconsciousness, and her hands bore calluses that spoke of hard work. Who was she? Where had she come from? And where was the baby's father? The question circled his mind as he tended the fire and listened to her labored breathing. By dawn, her fever had broken, and the bleeding had slowed to something that looked more normal, and Flynn finally let himself believe they might actually survive. He dozed in his chair near the hearth, jerking awake every few minutes to check on his patients, until the sun was fully up and the baby started crying with real hunger. He was heating more milk when he heard movement from the bed. The woman's eyes were open, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of his cabin, and as he watched, she turned her head slowly to look at him. "Where is my baby?" Her voice was hoarse but steady, and there was steel in it that surprised him. "Right here." Flynn carried the basket over so she could see. "A boy. He is doing well." She tried to sit up and failed, falling back with a gasp of pain. Flynn set the basket down and moved to help her, propping her up with the pillows and blankets so she could see the baby better without straining. "What happened?" she asked. "I remember the snow and then nothing. I found you yesterday in a drift about a mile from here. You had just given birth." He paused. "It is a miracle you are both alive." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you. I thought we were going to die." "You almost did." Flynn handed her a cup of water, and she drank gratefully. "What is your name, and where is your husband?" "Tessa Barrett. My husband Marcus went to Opal for help when our wagon broke down. He should have come back, but he did not, and the storm came, and I could not wait anymore." Her voice was hollow. "He is probably dead too." Flynn doubted that. A man who left his pregnant wife alone in a broken wagon and did not return was more likely drunk in a saloon than dead in the snow, but he kept that opinion to himself. "Opal is about 15 miles from here. Once you are strong enough to travel, I will take you there, and we can find out what happened." She nodded and then looked at the baby again, reaching out to touch the tiny hand. "I did not even name him yet. I was going to wait until Marcus could be part of it." "You have time," Flynn said. "Right now you need to rest and recover your strength. The baby needs milk, and I only have goat's milk, which is not ideal. When you are able to feed him yourself, that will be better." Her face flushed, but she nodded. They were past modesty, both understanding that survival trumped propriety out here. The next few days established a routine that felt almost normal. Tessa remained in bed, her body slowly healing from the trauma of birth and exposure. Flynn brought her food and water and changed her bandages with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he used for everything. The baby, whom Tessa had named Samuel after her father, grew stronger and began nursing successfully. Flynn found himself taking on tasks he had never imagined, from washing blood-stained linens to rocking a fussy infant while Tessa slept. It should have been awkward, sharing his small cabin with a woman and a newborn, but somehow it was not. Tessa was practical and uncomplaining, thanking him for his help but never becoming pathetic or demanding. She told him about her life in Missouri, her rush to marry Marcus when he had seemed so exciting and full of plans, and her growing realization during the journey west that she had made a terrible mistake. "He was not cruel," she said one evening as Flynn made stew over the fire. "Just weak. He drank when things got hard instead of facing them, and he talked big but never followed through on anything. I kept thinking he would change once we got settled, but now I think that was foolish of me." "People rarely change," Flynn said. "They just become more of what they already are." She smiled at that, a small, sad expression that made her look older than her years. "That is a hard philosophy for someone so young. I am 24, and I have seen enough of people to know it is true." "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. "You are clearly educated and capable. You could make a life in town." Flynn stirred the stew and considered the question. I like the quiet. I like knowing that if something goes wrong, it is because I made a mistake, not because someone else let me down. The wilderness makes sense to me in a way people never have. That seems lonely, Tessa said quietly. Maybe, but it is honest. As Tessa grew stronger, she began to move around the cabin, helping with small tasks despite Flynn's protests that she should rest. She cooked meals that were far better than anything he had made for himself, and she sang to Samuel in a clear, sweet voice that filled the cabin with something it had never held before. Flynn found himself listening to her while he worked on repairing his gear or cleaning his guns, and sometimes he would look up to find her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. 2 weeks after he had found her, the weather finally cleared enough for travel. Flynn knew he should take Tessa to Opal immediately so she could find out what had happened to her husband and start making plans for her future. But he found himself inventing reasons to delay. The trail needed more time to clear. The baby was too young to travel safely. Tessa was still recovering, and the journey might set her back. They were all true, but they were also excuses, and Flynn knew it. The truth was that he had grown accustomed to having them there. The cabin felt alive in a way it never had when he was alone, and Samuel's cries and Tessa's humming and the domestic rhythms of their days had become something he looked forward to instead of something to endure. He caught himself thinking about the future in ways he had never allowed before, imagining what it might be like to have this become permanent. But Tessa was married, and regardless of whether Marcus was alive or dead, Flynn had no right to think about her the way he was starting to. She was under his protection and dependent on his help, and any suggestion of more would be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. So he kept his growing feelings to himself and focused on the practical matters of getting her ready to leave. Tessa was having similar thoughts, though she tried to deny them to herself. She had married Marcus in a rush of feeling that she had thought was love, but now recognized as something more like desperation, a desire to escape her small-town life and find adventure. What she felt when she looked at Flynn was entirely different. It was built on watching him care for her son with infinite patience, on his quiet competence and his rare smiles, on the way he listened when she talked and never made her feel foolish for her opinions. She knew it was probably gratitude more than love. He had saved her life and Samuel's life, and it would be natural to confuse those feelings. But when he came in from checking on the horse with snow in his dark hair and color in his face from the cold, her heart did something complicated in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. The problem was Marcus. If he was alive, she was still married to him, bound by vows she had taken before God. The thought of going back to him made her feel sick, but the alternative was abandoning her marriage and becoming a woman who left her husband, which would ruin her reputation forever and make it impossible to survive in any decent town. And if Marcus was dead, she was even more trapped. As a widow with a newborn and no money, her options were severely limited. She could try to find work as a seamstress or laundress, but most places would not hire a woman with an infant to care for. She could try to go back to Missouri, but her parents had opposed her marriage to Marcus, and she did not think she could face their judgment and pity. She watched Flynn across the cabin as he sharpened his hunting knife with long, practiced strokes, his face concentrated on his task, and she thought about what it would be like to stay here, to build a life in this small cabin with this quiet man who had shown her more real kindness in 2 weeks than Marcus had in 6 months of marriage. It was an impossible dream, but she let herself imagine it anyway. On the 18th day, Flynn announced that they would leave for Opal the next morning. The weather was clear, and Tessa was strong enough to travel, and there was no good reason to delay any longer. Tessa agreed with a brightness she did not feel, and they spent the evening preparing for the journey in careful silence. That night, after Samuel was asleep and the fire had burned down to coals, Tessa finally spoke the thing that had been growing between them. "I do not want to leave," she said quietly. "I know that is wrong and complicated and probably just me being confused about what I feel, but it is true." Flynn looked at her across the dim cabin, his face half in shadow. "You are married, Tessa. I know. And if Marcus is alive, I will honor that, even though it will kill something in me to do it. She took a breath. But if he is not, if I am free, then I need you to know that these weeks here with you have been the happiest of my life, and I think maybe you feel something too, even if you have not said it. What I feel does not matter if you are married, Flynn said, but his voice was rough with emotion he was no longer hiding. But you do feel something. It was not a question. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words came slowly, like each one cost him something. I have lived alone for 3 years. I liked it that way. I did not want complications or connections or anyone depending on me. And then I found you in the snow and brought you here, and everything changed. He met her eyes. You and Samuel have become the reason I look forward to waking up. You have made this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. And yes, I feel something for you that is a great deal more than I should. Tessa felt tears on her face and did not bother to wipe them away. Then we will go to Opal tomorrow and find out what happened to Marcus. And if God is merciful, I will be free to choose my own life for the first time ever. The journey to Opal took most of the day, traveling slowly because of the baby and Tessa's still recovering strength. Flynn had rigged a sling for her to carry Samuel against her chest, and she rode behind him on the horse with her arms around his waist. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. Opal was a small but growing town that served the ranches and mines in the area. The main street had a general store, a saloon, a church, a hotel, and a handful of other businesses. Flynn led them straight to the sheriff's office, where a stocky man with a graying beard looked up from his desk in surprise. Flynn Ingram, as I live and breathe. What brings you to town? The sheriff's eyes moved to Tessa and widened further. And with a woman and baby, no less. Sheriff Morrison, this is Tessa Barrett. I found her and her newborn son 3 weeks ago after she gave birth in a snowdrift during that big storm. Her husband, Marcus Barrett, was supposed to be coming here for help after their wagon broke down. Do you know anything about him? The sheriff's face grew serious. Marcus Barrett. Yes, I know about him. He made it to town all right, showed up at the saloon the morning before that storm hit, saying his wife was waiting at a broken wagon out on the North Trail. Some of the men were getting ready to ride out when the storm came on fast and mean, too dangerous to travel. Barrett was supposed to wait it out with everyone else, but he got drunk instead and started a fight with another fellow over a card game. Tessa's grip on Flynn tightened, and he reached back to steady her. The fight turned bad, the sheriff continued. The other fellow pulled a knife and Barrett pulled his gun. By the time I got there, Barrett had shot the man dead and was bleeding pretty good himself from a knife wound in the gut. We got the doctor, but it was too late. Marcus Barrett died that same night. The words hung in the air of the small office. Tessa made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, a release of tension and grief and horrible relief all mixed together. Flynn kept his hand on her arm, anchoring her. So he never even tried to come back for me, she said finally. He got drunk and got himself killed while I was out there giving birth and dying in the snow. I am sorry, madam, the sheriff said, and he sounded like he meant it. That is a hard thing to learn about any man, let alone your husband. We buried him in the town cemetery. His belongings are over at the hotel, such as they were. Tessa straightened her shoulders. Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. At least now I know. They left the office and walked in silence to the hotel, where the proprietor gave them a small box containing Marcus's effects. There was not much: a change of clothes, a cheap pocket watch that had stopped working, a few dollars in coins, and a letter from Tessa's mother that he had apparently never bothered to give her. Tessa took the letter and the money and left the rest. I should probably feel worse than I do, she said, as they stood on the wooden sidewalk in the afternoon sun. But all I feel is free. Flynn looked down at her, this strong woman who had survived childbirth in a snowstorm and was now facing widowhood with more grace than most people could manage. You have every right to feel however you feel. He left you to die, Tessa. You do not owe him your grief. She nodded and shifted Samuel in her arms, and the baby chose that moment to wake and start fussing. Without thinking about it, Flynn reached over and took the child, settling him against his shoulder with the easy competence he had developed over the past weeks. Several people passing by stared openly at the unusual sight of the reclusive hunter holding a baby in the middle of town. "Where will you go now?" Flynn asked, even though he was desperately hoping he already knew the answer. Tessa looked up at him, and the expression on her face made his heart stumble in his chest. "I was hoping you might ask me to come back to the cabin with you, not as a patient or someone you are helping, but as someone who wants to build a life with you, if that is something you might want too." Flynn had never been good with words, but he tried now because this mattered more than anything ever had. "I want it more than I can say. I want you and Samuel with me. I want to wake up to your voice and fall asleep, knowing you are safe under my roof. I want to teach your son to hunt and fish and survive in the wild, and I want to give you more children if you want them. I want to build a real home instead of just a cabin, and I want to spend every day earning the right to your love." "You already have it," Tessa said softly. "You have had it almost since the moment I woke up and saw you taking care of Samuel like he was your own. You saved us, Flynn, and not just from the snow. You saved me from a life I did not want with a man who did not value me. You gave me a future I can actually be happy about." Right there on the main street of Opal, Wyoming, with half the town watching, Flynn kissed her. It was gentle and careful, and full of all the promise of the life they were going to build together. Samuel, pressed between them, made a small sound that might have been approval. They stayed in Opal long enough to purchase supplies, and for Flynn to officially claim Tessa as his intended, making it clear to anyone who might gossip that she would become his wife as soon as a proper mourning period had passed. The town minister, a kind man named Reverend Hutchins, privately agreed that under the circumstances, a short mourning period would be acceptable given Marcus's behavior and Tessa's need for security as a new mother. 6 weeks later, on a clear spring morning with the last of the snow melting from the mountains, Tessa Barrett became Tessa Ingram in a simple ceremony at the Opal Church. Samuel was held by Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff's wife, who had taken a keen interest in Tessa's welfare and declared herself the baby's honorary grandmother. Flynn wore his best clothes, which was not saying much, but Tessa had sewn herself a new dress from fabric she bought with the last of Marcus's money, turning it into something beautiful and practical that suited her new life. After the ceremony, they returned to the cabin that was now truly their home. Over the past weeks, Flynn had worked to expand it, adding a separate bedroom and improving the windows to let in more light. Tessa had brought her own touches, sewing curtains and arranging the space to be more livable. It was still small and simple, but it was theirs, built on honesty and respect, and the kind of love that grows from seeing someone at their worst and choosing them anyway. Their life fell into a rhythm that suited them both. Flynn continued to hunt and guide, but he took fewer jobs that kept him away for days, wanting to be present for Tessa and Samuel. Tessa discovered she had a talent for tanning hides and making them into soft leather goods, and soon she was selling gloves and bags to the general store in Opal for extra money. Together they worked on improving the cabin and clearing more land for a garden. Samuel thrived, growing chubby and strong on his mother's milk and the love of two parents who adored him. Flynn had never imagined himself as a father, but he took to it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving animals into the wood that made Tessa cry with how beautiful it was. He walked the floor with Samuel during fussy nights so Tessa could sleep, and he talked to the baby constantly, narrating everything he was doing as if Samuel could understand. "You need to know how to read the weather," Flynn would say, holding the infant up to the window. "See those clouds? They mean rain by evening, and that wind coming from the north brings cold. Your mother thinks I am crazy, talking to you like this, but you are listening. I can tell." Tessa would watch them together, and feel her heart might burst with the fullness of it. This was what love was supposed to be, she realized. Not the dramatic passion she had mistaken for love with Marcus, but this steady, daily choosing of each other. It was Flynn bringing her coffee in bed on cold mornings. It was her sewing a tear in his coat without being asked. It was the way they moved around each other in the small cabin, each aware of where the other was at all times. It was the conversations that lasted long into the night, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears they had never told anyone else. The first year of their marriage brought challenges as well as joys. A harsh winter tested their supplies and their fortitude, with snow piling so high they could not leave the cabin for days at a time. A pack of wolves killed one of their goats, and they had to work together to reinforce the shelter. Flynn fell through ice while checking his trap line and came home shaking with cold, and Tessa spent a terrifying night warming him and praying he would not develop pneumonia. But they met each challenge together, and each one seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their bond. Tessa learned to shoot accurately, something Flynn insisted on so she could protect herself and Samuel when he was away. Flynn learned to be less solitary, accepting that Tessa's need for occasional company and conversation was valid and important. They made trips to Opal more frequently, and Tessa developed friendships with several of the town women who initially had been suspicious of her quick remarriage but came to respect her strength and genuine happiness. When Samuel was 15 months old, Tessa discovered she was pregnant again. She was nervous, the memory of giving birth in the Snowdrift still occasionally haunting her dreams, but Flynn was quietly thrilled and determined that this time would be completely different. "You are having this baby in a real bed, in a warm house with me right there, and a doctor if we need one," he said firmly. "I am not taking any chances." As her pregnancy progressed, Flynn became almost comically protective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a spoon. Tessa found it both annoying and endearing, and she had to constantly remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she told him as he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I am not going to break." "I know that," he said. "But you are also not going to take unnecessary risks. Not after what you went through with Samuel. Humor me, Tessa." She did, mostly because she could see the real fear beneath his overprotectiveness. He had found her nearly dead in the snow, and that experience had marked him as much as it had marked her. Their daughter was born in September of 1884 in the bedroom Flynn had built, with Mrs. Morrison attending as midwife and Flynn pacing outside until Tessa called him in to meet his daughter. She was tiny and perfect, with dark hair like her mother and what promised to be her father's gray eyes. "Grace," Tessa said, looking down at the baby in her arms. "Grace Flynn Ingram, because I have received so much grace in my life, more than I deserve." Flynn sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Tessa, and one finger caught in Grace's small fist. "You deserve everything good in this world," he said quietly. "You and both these children are my whole world." With two young children, the cabin became even more crowded, and Flynn began planning a larger house. Over the next 2 years, working when he could between hunting trips and guiding jobs, he built them a proper home. It was still modest by any standard, but it had 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a parlor with a stone fireplace, and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the mountains. Tessa cried when she first walked through the finished house, running her hands over the smooth wood and the glass windows and the stove Flynn had ordered special from Cheyenne. "I cannot believe this is ours," she said. "I cannot believe this is my life now." Samuel was 3 by then, running wild and fearless through the wilderness with his father, learning to identify tracks and read the signs of weather and animals. Grace was a quieter child, content to sit with her mother and watch everything with serious eyes. Tessa had started teaching Samuel his letters, and she dreamed of the day when they might afford to send both children to a real school. Money was always tight, but they managed. Flynn's reputation as a hunter and guide grew, and wealthy men from as far away as Chicago came to hire him to lead them on expeditions. Tessa's leather goods sold well, and she had started taking in sewing work as well. They saved carefully, planning for the future and the education they wanted for their children. In 1886, Tessa became pregnant for the third time. This baby was unplanned but welcomed, though Tessa was exhausted from caring for two small children and running the household. Flynn hired a young woman from town to help with the housework and childcare, giving Tessa time to rest and recover her strength. Their second son was born in March of 1887, an easy birth that took only a few hours and left Tessa tired but healthy. They named him Thomas Samuel Ingram, after Tessa's father and their first child, and he was a happy baby who rarely cried and smiled at everyone. With three children under 4 years old, life became wonderfully chaotic. The house was always full of noise and laughter and the occasional tears. Flynn, who had once thought he needed solitude to be happy, discovered that he actually thrived in the midst of his loud, loving family. He came home from hunting trips, eager to hear everything that had happened while he was gone, and he spent his evenings playing with the children and talking with Tessa about their days. Tessa bloomed in motherhood and marriage in a way she had never imagined possible. She had gone from being a desperate young woman married to the wrong man, to a widow giving birth in a snowstorm, to a wife and mother surrounded by love and security. The contrast sometimes struck her so forcefully that she had to stop what she was doing and just breathe through the gratitude. One evening when Samuel was 5 and Grace was 3 and Thomas was 6 months old, Tessa and Flynn sat on their porch after the children were finally asleep. The summer air was warm and full of the sound of crickets, and the stars were so bright they looked like holes in the sky. "Do you ever think about that day I found you?" Flynn asked, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Every day," Tessa said. "Sometimes I dream about it and wake up convinced I am still in that snowdrift, that all of this was just something I imagined while I was dying." "You are not dying. You are very much alive, and you are stuck with me and these three wild children forever." Tessa laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. "There is nowhere else I would rather be stuck. You know that, right? That you saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Flynn said. "I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions but not really living. You and the children gave me purpose beyond just survival. You made me want to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Flynn spoke again. "I want to buy more land, maybe run some cattle. I am good at the hunting and guiding, but it takes me away from home too much, and I want to be here more as the children grow. What would you think about that?" "I think that is a wonderful idea," Tessa said. "We could build something for Samuel and Grace and Thomas to inherit, something permanent." And so they did. Flynn bought adjacent land from the government claims office and began building a small herd. It was hard work, learning a new skill and establishing a ranch from nothing, but they approached it the same way they approached everything, together, with determination and patience. The years passed in the way years do when you are busy and happy, each day bleeding into the next, until suddenly you look up and realize how much has changed. Samuel grew tall and serious, with his mother's determination and his father's steady nature. Grace became a voracious reader, devouring every book they could get her hands on and constantly asking questions about the world beyond Wyoming. Thomas was the wild one, fearless and cheerful, always getting into scrapes and adventures. In 1890, when Samuel was 7, Tessa and Flynn made the difficult decision to send him to the school in Opal during the week, where he would board with the Morrisons and come home on weekends. It broke Tessa's heart to let him go, but she knew he needed more education than she could provide at home. Grace would follow when she was old enough. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Flynn proved to have good instincts for cattle, and within a few years, they had a respectable herd. They hired help during busy times, young men looking for work and willing to learn. The house expanded again, adding more rooms as they could afford it, becoming a real homestead. Tessa sometimes thought about Marcus and the life she would have had if he had not died in that saloon. She would probably be a widow anyway by now, she thought, given his drinking and poor judgment. But she and Samuel would have been alone and struggling, and she certainly would not have Grace and Thomas and this beautiful life she had built with Flynn. She did not wish him dead exactly, but she could not help being grateful that his bad choices had freed her to find her real life. It was complicated, that gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with relief, but she had learned to accept complicated feelings. Life was rarely simple. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Flynn took Tessa to Cheyenne for a real hotel stay and a dinner at a fancy restaurant. It was the first time they had been away from the children overnight, and Mrs. Morrison had practically pushed them out the door, insisting she would take excellent care of Samuel, Grace, and Thomas. Sitting in the hotel restaurant, with her hair properly styled, and wearing a dress Flynn had secretly commissioned from the best seamstress in Opal, Tessa felt like a completely different person from the desperate woman who had given birth in a snowdrift 10 years ago. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, watching her with the steady gaze that still made her heart skip after all these years. "I am thinking about how far we have come," she said. "Both of us. You were a lonely man living in a cabin, and I was a foolish girl married to the wrong man. And then the worst thing that could have happened did happen, and it turned into the best thing." "I do not think I would phrase it quite that way," Flynn said with a slight smile. "Finding you half dead with a newborn was not exactly the best thing." "But it led to this," Tessa said, gesturing at the space between them that held 10 years of love and work and children and building a life. "It led to us, and I would go through all of it again, the wagon breaking down and the storm and the fear and the pain, if I knew it would end with you." Flynn reached across the table and took her hand. "You are an extraordinary woman, Tessa Ingram." "Have I told you that recently?" "Not in the last few hours," she said with a smile. "You should probably tell me again." He did, and the words were sweet. But what mattered more was the way he looked at her like she was the most valuable thing in his world. That look had not changed in 10 years, and Tessa knew with absolute certainty that it never would. They returned home to chaos, as Thomas had apparently decided to climb onto the roof and gotten stuck there, requiring Sheriff Morrison to bring a ladder. The children threw themselves at their parents with such enthusiasm that they nearly knocked Tessa over, all talking at once about everything that had happened in the day and a half they had been gone. "See," Mrs. Morrison said with a laugh, "I told you they would survive without you. Although I recommend not leaving Thomas unsupervised for more than 5 minutes at a time. That boy is part mountain goat." Life continued its steady rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children. Samuel showed a talent for working with horses and began breaking them for local ranchers to earn extra money. Grace announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a teacher someday, and Tessa and Flynn began saving towards sending her to normal school when she was old enough. Thomas remained a whirlwind of energy and scraped knees, but his fearlessness made him an excellent ranch hand, even at a young age. In 1892, Tessa gave birth to their fourth and final child, another daughter they named Margaret after Flynn's mother. Flynn was 43 by then, and Tessa was 31, and they both agreed their family was complete. Margaret was a peaceful baby who grew into a gentle child, happiest when helping her mother in the garden or playing with the barn cats. She was the pet of the whole family, spoiled by her older siblings and adored by her parents. The ranch prospered beyond their early dreams. By the mid-1890s, the Ingram homestead was known throughout the region for quality cattle and well-trained horses. Flynn hired permanent help, good men who became like family, and Tessa kept them all fed and clothed and cared for when they were sick or injured. Their children grew and thrived. Samuel, at 16, was a quiet, capable young man who had his father's way with animals and his mother's steady common sense. Grace, at 14, was whip-smart and determined, already teaching younger children in Sunday school and planning her future. Thomas, at 12, was still wild but channeling that energy into useful work, always the first to volunteer for any task that involved horses or adventure. Margaret at 5 was the light of everyone's life, sweet-natured and kind. On a summer evening in 1897, 14 years after Flynn had found Tessa in the snow, the whole family gathered on the large porch of their house for supper. The table was full of food Tessa and Grace had prepared, and the conversation was loud and full of laughter as everyone talked over each other. Flynn looked around at his family. This miracle that had come from one desperate choice to stop and check on what he thought was a dead animal in the snow. Samuel was describing breaking a particularly difficult horse. Grace was arguing with Thomas about something he had done to annoy her. Margaret was leaning against Tessa's side, half asleep in the warm evening air. Tessa caught his eye and smiled. That same smile she had given him when she woke up in his cabin 14 years ago and realized she was going to survive. He smiled back, and in that moment, everything that had happened, all the fear and struggle and hard work and joy, felt like it had been leading to exactly this: a table full of food and children and love, a home they had built together out of nothing but determination and hope. That night, after the children were finally all in bed and the house was quiet, Flynn and Tessa lay together in their bed with the window open to let in the cool mountain air. "Happy?" Flynn asked, pulling her close. "Absurdly happy," Tessa said. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is my real life, that I get to wake up every morning in this house with you and our children and everything we have built." "Believe it," Flynn said, kissing her forehead. "You earned every bit of this happiness, Tessa. We both did." She tilted her face up to kiss him properly, and they made love with the quiet intensity of people who have been together long enough to know exactly what the other needs and wants. Afterward, Tessa lay with her head on Flynn's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow back to normal. "Tell me again about the day you found me," she said sleepily. She asked him this sometimes, needing to hear the story of their beginning. "I almost did not stop," Flynn said, as he always did when she asked. "The snow was so thick I could barely see, and I was eager to get home. But the horse shied, and I went to look, and there you were, just a dark shape in the snow, and I was so sure you were already dead. But you checked anyway. But I checked anyway. And your eyes opened, and you looked at me, and you said, 'The baby, please.' And that was it. I was lost from that moment, even though it took me weeks to understand it." "I knew the moment I woke up and saw you feeding Samuel," Tessa said. "I saw how gentle you were with him, how careful, and I knew you were a good man. And then as I got stronger and watched how you lived, how honest and steady you were, I realized I was falling in love with you. Lucky for both of us that Marcus made the choices he did," Flynn said, and then immediately regretted it. "I am sorry. I should not have said that." "No, it is true," Tessa said. "He set me free by being exactly who he was. I am not glad he died, but I am glad I got to live this life instead of the one I would have had with him." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the way they had slept for 14 years, and the house was peaceful around them, full of the breathing and small sounds of their children. The years continued to unfold. Samuel eventually married a good woman from Opal and started his own ranch on land Flynn helped him purchase. Grace went to normal school in Cheyenne and became a teacher, just as she had dreamed, eventually running the school in Opal. Thomas took over most of the day-to-day operation of the ranch, his energy and enthusiasm making him an excellent manager. Margaret grew into a beautiful young woman who married a kind rancher and gave Tessa and Flynn their first grandchildren. Flynn and Tessa aged together, their bodies slowing, but their love as constant as the mountains surrounding them. They became the respected elders of the community, the couple whose story everyone knew, the man who had found a woman giving birth in a snowdrift, and the woman who had survived to build an empire with him. In 1910, 27 years after that terrible, beautiful day in the snow, Tessa and Flynn celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and 11 grandchildren. The party was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed half of Opal. Sheriff Morrison, now retired and gray, stood to make a toast. I remember when Flynn brought Tessa into my office all those years ago. She had just given birth in a blizzard and found out she was a widow, and she was holding that baby like he was the only good thing left in the world. And Flynn, who I had never seen with anyone ever, was looking at her like she was a miracle. I think I knew even then that they were going to make something special together. He raised his glass. To Flynn and Tessa, who built a life and a family out of tragedy and luck and sheer stubborn determination. May they have many more years together. Everyone drank and cheered, and Tessa felt tears running down her face. Flynn handed her his handkerchief, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," she whispered to him, quiet enough that only he could hear. "For stopping that day. For checking even though you thought I was dead. For saving us." "Thank you for surviving," Flynn whispered back. "For being strong enough to stay alive until I found you. For choosing me when you could have gone anywhere and done anything." "I will always choose you," Tessa said, "in this life and whatever comes after." They kissed, and their grandchildren made exaggerated gagging sounds, and everyone laughed, and the party continued long into the evening with music and dancing and joy. That night, lying in their bed in the house Flynn had built with his own hands, Tessa thought about the girl she had been 27 years ago, desperate and pregnant and married to a man who did not value her. That girl could never have imagined this life, this profound happiness, this family she had built with a man who had seen her at her absolute lowest and loved her anyway. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, because he always knew when she was thinking instead of sleeping. "I am thinking about what a strange and wonderful thing life is," Tessa said. "How the worst day of my life led to the best days. How I had to nearly die to learn how to really live. Do you ever regret any of it? The hard parts?" "Never," Tessa said firmly. "Every bit of it, even the terrible parts, brought me here. To you and our children and this life we have made. I would not change a single thing." Flynn pulled her closer, and they fell asleep, the way they always had, tangled together, complete. The years after that continued to be good, marked by the ordinary joys and sorrows of a well-lived life. They lost friends and gained more grandchildren. They saw Wyoming become a state, and the wild frontier slowly transform into something more settled and civilized. They watched automobiles begin to appear on the roads and electricity reach Opal, and they marveled at how much the world had changed since that snowy day in 1883. But through all the changes, their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set over the mountains. They still shared quiet conversations in the darkness before sleep. They still knew each other's thoughts and finished each other's sentences. Flynn lived to be 71, passing quietly in his sleep in 1925 after a full life of purpose and love. Tessa held his hand as he slipped away, her heart breaking even as she was grateful they had had so many years together. She lived 6 more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them the legacy of that day in the snow when a lonely hunter stopped to check on what he thought was a dead animal and found his entire future instead. When Tessa died in 1931 at the age of 70, she was buried next to Flynn in the cemetery overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her last words, spoken to Grace who sat beside her bed, were simple and true. "I had the most extraordinary life," she said, "and it all started the day I gave birth in a snowdrift and a good man found me." Tell your children that story, Grace. Tell them how love can come from the most unlikely places and how sometimes the worst things that happen to us clear the way for the best things. The ranch passed through generations of Ingrams, each one adding to the legacy Flynn and Tessa had started. The story of how it all began became family legend, told and retold to each new generation of children. The girl who survived childbirth in a snowstorm, the lonely hunter who stopped when he might have ridden past, the love that grew between them, steady and true and strong enough to build an empire on. In the end, it was a story about resilience and second chances, about how sometimes you have to nearly lose everything to find what you were always meant to have. It was a story about a woman who was stronger than she knew and a man who was gentler than he believed. It was a story about building a life from nothing but hope and hard work and choosing each other every single day. It was, in every way that mattered, a story about love.